Hello, I'm Leisha Holmes, and I'm your host on the Recruiters Recruitment podcast, sponsored by Hoxo Media. And I'm absolutely thrilled to welcome today a very familiar face to my fellow cohort from the Hoxo Academy with Sean Anderson. This is Kyle Winterbottom, and he is the founder of Orbition and also the host of his own podcast, Driven by Data. Welcome to you today, Kyle. How are you?
I'm very well. Thank you very much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here, and glad you got the name right.
I did. Well, it took a few goes, didn't it? So
It did. It did. Bit of coaching at the start.
great coaching on how to pronounce what would seemingly be a very simple word, actually, to orbit and have ambition. Well,
Yeah.
thank you so much for joining me today. And obviously, you and I have known each other. We've met, I think, in some of your previous roles, and obviously, we have got to know each other over the last few months. And
Yep.
we talk today about a topic that I think we obviously both hold dear. So, do you want to talk to us a little bit about what we're going to talk about today, personal branding?
Yeah. So I think obviously something that if I'm being honest, it's probably only really been the last 3 or 4 years that's kind of come to the forefront for me. My background, I was S3 born and bred from a recruitment standpoint. So I guess that comes with a certain theme of recruitment, if you want to call it that. And but yeah, I think I've been lucky enough that I kind of adopted the whole personal branding piece relatively early, and stuck with it. And I think it's started to pay off, especially over the last couple of years, and then leading into when I started Orbition. So yeah, I'm looking forward to the questions that you're going to ask me.
Yeah, so you've alluded to something there, which I think is a really important point to make, in that you came from a sort of the S3 background, so a more traditional recruitment background, which I think again you and I share, because I came from Primetime, which was a similar sort of, you sat there, you did X amount of sales calls, it was all new business development, you didn't rely on anything that was sent through email. It was you had to make an impact by sort of basically cold calling people, whether that was a candidate. So how have you developed your brand then? You say specifically over the last 3 years. Just talk us through that. Was there a revelation? Was there a moment where you just thought this isn't working anymore? Or did you do it to make yourself stand out? Just talk us through how that brand element has changed for you.
Yeah, good question. So I think it was an amalgamation of a few things, to be honest with you. As we touched on, S3 trained, where it was just, you pick up the phone, you've got a list, you call through, and if you're good at your job, you'll get something from it. And that was fine, and that worked. And then, I went on my own journey around the world. So, went to Dubai, went to New York, and effectively worked in a few roles where I was more hands off. And then came back into a business. A lot of what I've done over the years has been starting something from scratch. And it was at the time where I came back to the UK from New York, where I'd been more hands off in New York, coming back into a business where I was going to start an office from scratch. I was going to have to get on the phone and start billing. And, my market and my reputation and my presence in the market had obviously dwindled with me being away for 3 and a bit, 4 years. And if I'm being really honest, I was kind of just thinking, there must be a better way than just having to call through switchboards, because I don't have a database. I don't know who I'm calling. I don't have any clients. I don't have any candidates. There's got to be something, a little bit more smarter than this, was probably my main driver at that point. And yeah, that coupled with the fact of, I'd been away for a long time and I came back and nothing had really changed. As far as recruitment goes, people were still just smashing through switchboards and, smiling and dialing and all that, CV specking and all that good stuff. And I was just kind of thinking if you can be a bit different, you're going to stand out. And I think that was the kind of the main catalyst for me, was how do I do something different to kind of stand out? And, I've been on previous podcasts. I was on Sean's podcast and we kind of had a discussion about this, but it wasn't I didn't go out there initially and set out to set the world on fire with, I'm going to be different. I think it was at the start, it was merely attacked to try and, win business and find candidates, because ultimately that's what it boils down to. So I'm a, big believer that it certainly works. If you do it right, it'll be very fruitful for you. But I think you've got to stick with it, but it's also got to supplement some of the more traditional recruitment methods, in my opinion. So that's kind of how it all started for me, really.
I think that last point is a really important caveat with all of this, that we're not suggesting for 1 minute that you're saying don't make phone calls, don't get out and see clients when we're obviously able to and we're not in lockdown. What you're saying is it should be a blended approach, but by actually picking up the phone and doing a cold call, if you've worked on your brand, it's not going to be cold. They're going to be aware of who you are and what you're talking about. So I think that's really important. So when you said, I mean, let's talk about your business. So, you know, you started, was it September 2020?
Yep, it was. Yep.
Well remembered there. So talk to us about how that came about, and then when you've looked at your brand, what's your intention as a company, and then also as an individual, so to speak, to make it scalable.
Yeah, I think that's a good question, trying to get the blend of the company and the personal brand right. And I'm sure we'll get into this a little later on, but I think that's where a lot of companies struggle, because it's you know, if someone's bought into this process, it's quite easy for the recruiter as a singular individual to build a personal brand. If that person, you know, gets up off the seat and walks out your door and doesn't come back, you've just lost that. So you know, I think it's been one of those journeys for me. I mean, I started the business because, if I'm being really honest, I think there's too many recruitment companies out there that try to be too many things to too many people. You know, they're all a specialist in something, and I've never quite really understood that, if I'm honest. And you know, hands up, I've worked in those businesses before, and I've said all the same phrases. So you know, it kind of is what it is, I guess. But ultimately, I think it started to kind of really come to light for me in terms of actually being a specialist in your market, coincided with the whole, how do you build a brand so that you can work smarter and not harder. So, you know, I'd been at Lawrence Harvey for 2.5 years. We'd had quite a lot of success. We took a long-term relationship, building a personal brand approach with that office, you know, in just in one market, in one geography, and we'd position ourselves really well. And ultimately, you know, there probably wasn't much more for me to achieve there. You know, we're a fairly sizable business, 200 odd people, 8 offices. The only way for me to grow in that business would be to, you know, go against everything I'd stood for, you know, stood against, should I say, and kind of start adding different markets and stuff. And I kind of just felt that's not what I wanted to do. There was no opportunity for me to move laterally in terms of geographies, and, you know, because we had other offices that looked after different areas. So that was kind of the catalyst, really. And to be honest, it's probably something that I've always knew I was going to do. It was just a case of when. Naturally, the wife probably didn't think, you know, the middle of the pandemic was quite the right time, but you know, I guess I was, yeah, I guess I was conscious that, you know, what I didn't want to do was to wait until the markets kind of returned. You know, I didn't want to kind of come to the forefront at this time, let's say, and, you know, announce my arrival. And kind of, you know, I'm here to kind of now pick up the jobs now that the market's good again. I wanted to try and get the brand up and running, and so people knew it, and we, you know, had a bit of a reputation, and we could go into this year, you know, with, you know, being established to a certain extent. So that was, you know, why we made the decision to set the business up when we did.
So I mean, and look, you know, I think it's really important to sort of keep this theme. So for those who are listening on the podcast and watching on YouTube, you know, recruitment leaders, there is that constant conflict, isn't there, that when you're looking at branding, and obviously we're talking about content, how much of it should be centered around your company values and your company message, and how much of it should be around that personal space that each individual has as a vertical, you know, that niche, because it's all about niche. I'm totally with you on that. So how can leaders ensure that they're not compromising the company values versus people developing a scalable personal brand approach?
I think that's where it becomes really difficult, right? So my view on this is, you know, if you're a technology recruitment specialist, and obviously that in itself is really broad, but my view is, how can you as a brand look after and cater to and provide content to and build a brand to the technology landscape? Because there's a million and one variations of different tech, right? So you're effectively paying yourself as a generalist, and then the people that work for you become specialists in one area. So it's very difficult from a brand level to, in my opinion, market to a particular audience that over time is going to build that brand. You know, so I think that's something that companies have to consider. But ultimately, look, we're not going to change the way the recruitment world works, right? There are always going to be tech recruitment companies that cover a whole load of different verticals. So I guess it's a case of finding what works from a company perspective in terms of the content that you're talking about, and I guess identifying the niche areas and the proposition that you want to be known for. And I know that that's something that we did at Lawrence Harvey. They set out as a ERP SAP business effectively in the early 2000s, and come 2015 they realized that data analytics, cybersecurity and cloud technology were probably the three areas of the future. So kind of pivoted the proposition to kind of cater to that. And then obviously you've got the people within the business then that have a personal brand and build that personal brand out. But that was something that I'm very conscious of, and why Orbition is only ever going to be data and analytics related, because from a business standpoint it makes it so much easier for let's say we fast forward 24 months when hopefully I'm not as involved day to day in the recruitment, because if I'm being really candid now, who has a bigger brand name, myself or Orbition? It's myself. Now obviously that's a problem, that needs to change, because I'm not going to be here forever effectively. So I'm kind of working on, I guess, trying to wean my way out of that and bringing the brand into it. But it's difficult. I think in terms of the values, I don't think anyone's sat here saying you need to compromise your values, you rip them up and throw them in the bin and start again from a brand perspective. It's just a case of, for me, having a clear strategy on what markets you want to do and go and actually being known as a specialist in that space. As a brand, try to cater towards that audience, and then have your people that work for you start to supplement that with their personal brand in that space. If that answers your question.
Yeah, no, it does. And actually, when you just said that point there, it's, somebody said to me years ago, without Leisha Homes, what is key recruitment? And of course, similar to you, the business is me, I am the business, but it made me really stop and think. Like, if you extracted me, because obviously I don't want to be the day-to-day recruiter forever, but at some point, I will have to hire in people, obviously then Shannon came along, but make sure the brand itself is standalone as opposed to it just being about Leisha Homes. But of course, everything that I drive through my channel on LinkedIn is as Leisha Homes, but we make sure that everything we share on key recruitment is replicating that. It's all about the shared value. So I think it's easy to say that when you're a smaller business, but thinking, you're thinking about your large scale clients, I'm thinking about my large scale clients. It is a real challenge to ensure that, that intellectual property that each person has as a recruiter isn't then going to get up and walk away, because you've got things like your communities now. Obviously, people are setting up podcasts, you've done it yourself. We'll talk about that in a minute. But actually it's making sure it all blends together. And I think there's certainly in the technology space, it's going to change constantly. There's going to be new niches coming out that we don't even know about because technology changes constantly.
Absolutely. I mean, I say this all the time to kind of clients now, right? Because, I'm a new business. People are looking, people that know me have no problem trusting me. But if they don't know me, like I've started to do work out in the States, for example, obviously I can show them loads of testimonials. So that gives me credibility. But, they don't know me. They don't know the name. So, that bit becomes difficult. And that's where really the brand has to, supersede me, really. But I say to clients all the time, we're never going to get away from this fact that we're a specialist. For some businesses that's going to work. They want to work with a specialist in one area, and for others they're going to turn around and say, you know what, I'd rather work with a generalist who can look after all of our technology and anything relatable, all of those roles, and that's cool. And if that's the case, then they shouldn't be speaking to us. But it's like cybersecurity 10 years ago, that came onto it, and all of a sudden every tech recruitment business in the world picked, all right, so we're going to do that. Data's been the same. You've got RPA, robotics. That's then come since data. There'll be something else after that, and after that, and after that, and after that. And I think a lot of businesses often grow by adding more markets. Where especially small to mid-sized businesses, they grow by adding more markets in one geography, whereas my plan effectively is to grow by scaling the business geographically. We're going to do one thing, we're going to do it well, and if that means that we need 5 offices globally, well, then so be it. But we're not going to kind of I guess as far as values go, we're not going to substitute
No.
our values for another service offering, because it gives us the opportunity to grow, because I think there's so much value in just being known for dominating one area.
Yeah. No, I do think you get people that kind of subscribe to one or the other. And I personally believe that you should be that go-to specialist. And I think that that's where your brand won't then be compromised, because you can then focus your company values on, this is what we do and these are the areas. Because if you think about, your podcast now, which is driven by data, is hosted by you, but it's very much branded as Orbition, isn't it? It's not Cal Winterbottom,
Yep.
it's Orbition.
Yep.
So if you're thinking about 10 years time, if you've got, I mean, you might not need 5 global offices because we can work remotely, can't we? But let's say you've got 25 heads, there aren't going to be 25 podcasts. That would just be crazy.
Yep.
So I think that's where, think about it in more simplistic terms. So, I mean, what are your sort of final recommendations, I guess, for maybe more recruiters rather than the leaders listening, because we do have a real split actually across our audience, which is wonderful. So if you're listening to this and you're a recruiter, what would you recommend, Kyle, in terms of making their brands, their personal brand, stand out whilst not compromising their employer? What can people do differently?
So, I mean, I think this is a real tough one, because for most recruitment businesses, and I'm talking about the businesses as an entity, there's still this, I guess, disparity between having that personal brand and marketing led approach versus the old traditional methods. And I think often most businesses kind of look at the marketing brand piece as supplementary. And it is to a certain extent, but to see the true value, you've just got to immerse yourself in it. So, I think there's this almost misconception that, okay, well, if this person comes to me and says, right, I want to grow my business by, growing a personal brand and becoming the celebrity in this space and being known and all this type of stuff, I think most business leaders think that that's going to come at the expense of picking up the phone. And actually, the reality is it's not. It's just going to make it easier for them to be heard and to pick, for them to pick up the phone and people to kind of answer them and have, business coming to your people, as opposed to, your people having to make 100 cold calls a day to try and get a client on the phone. So it's that, I guess it's trying to get that balance right, but trying to portray the message that this is going to help you longer term. But I think most businesses try it. They don't see results overnight because it's not something that happens overnight. And then what happens is they go, it's a lot of work, or it doesn't work, and they just go back to doing what they're doing. But
get off social media. You don't need, get on the phone. But actually, what you're doing by creating that level of content, which is, it does take time to do, you're actually creating an inbound customer relationship. People will come to you because of what they've read or what they've listened to or what you've said. But that won't replace you picking up the phone and catching up with a client and speaking to a candidate. Of course it won't. No. But it's very hard to put a measure on those things in the early days until it becomes sort of self-perpetuating.
Yeah, and that's the thing, right? It's certainly not going to happen overnight. It might not even happen within the first year, So, and that's the thing, when I speak to other recruitment leaders and they're thinking about doing this, that's always my first point is, don't do it for a couple of weeks and then think, oh, well, no one's calling me. Well, no, because it doesn't happen like that. You've got to build relationships with that community. And I think one of the key things that I always touch on, going back to your questions about, what should recruiters think about, is you've got to be willing to kind of almost frame it in your mind as you're giving back to that community. Think of it as kind of good karma. You're going to give them a load of stuff for free that they can soak up and use, and it will benefit them, and don't expect anything in return. But ultimately what that will allow you to do is people will see it, and then when you're making your cold calls, when you've got to do your 10 before 10 because you're being forced to, people will probably answer the phone, rather than having to make dial out 80 times to get 5 people on the phone. You might only need to dial out 30 times because people might be more open to speaking to you because they've seen your face on LinkedIn, they've seen your content. It gives you a platform to show that you're credible. And I think in this day and age, that's really what it all comes down to, is that recruitment's got a bad name, right? Let's not beat around the bush, and in some instances rightly so, but in a lot of instances not. But we all get tarred with the same brush, and it gives you an opportunity to show that you know your market, you're connected to people, you can actually help people, and you're happy to kind of give back. And I think that's the thing. You've just got to be willing and understand that it's not going to happen overnight, and at times it will feel like you're doing a load of work and giving it all away for free, and there's nothing in return. But ultimately, over time, you'll reap all those rewards and more. Is kind of how I've always viewed it, and because how it's worked for me, really.
Well, I think it's a perfectly viable and strategic sort of blended approach that will, I think, become the norm for most recruiters that are listening to this at whatever time or whenever you listen to this. It doesn't matter when it is. I think, the reality is it will never replace, like we were always threatened by technology. Human beings are never going to be replaced by an app, because ultimately we want to speak to somebody, we want someone to listen to us. But equally, we can share valuable information and not expect anything back in return. But the reality is there will be compensation for that. There's no question about it. So as we record this in January 2021, what does your future look like? What have you got planned this year? Have you got anything exciting happening on your podcast or anything else coming up?
The podcast is still ongoing. So I rolled out the podcast officially. I mean, the second podcast I've done. So, a little bit easier for me, I guess, in that regard. But I think 27th of October was the first episode. Episode 17 went live today. I kind of work a weekly cycle in advance, so there's always 4 episodes. I'm always 4 weeks ahead, effectively. Loads of good people on the podcast, still doing the events, obviously virtually, because we're not allowed to sit around a round table anymore. And then as far as business goes, we're just looking to grow, add a few people this year. Longer term, as I said, offices elsewhere in the world. So we're doing work at the minute across the UK and the US. So at some point in time, the wife might get away about moving back out of the UK. We'll see. But we're growing and actually, looking for people right now, I guess.
That's fantastic. Well, it's very exciting, and we'll all sit back and watch as you no doubt achieve your goals. It's brilliant, and we'll make sure that all the links to your Driven by Data podcast are on here as well. And thank you so much for joining me today. I really appreciate it, Kyle.
No problem at all.
It's been a pleasure.